Winter had come early to Dry Creek, not with fury, but with stillness, a hush that settled over the valley like a thick wool blanket, soft but unrelenting. The sky had held its breath for days now, and the wind, when it came, didn't scream, it whispered. Jonas Calloway stood at the edge of his porch, hands in his coat pockets, eyes scanning the ridgeline, as he had done every morning for the last 7 years. 34 years old, though he felt older, carved by solitude and seasons, the way rivers carve stone. His cabin was solid, but plain built from quarried rock, held together with old nails and older memory. It had once held 2 hearts, now it held one, and the ghost of the other. The coffee in his cup had gone cold. He hadn't noticed. The world was quiet until she came. At first, he thought she was a trick of the morning mist, a shape half-formed, trailing smoke and snow. But as she drew closer, the details sharpened. A woman wrapped in a coat, too thin for the weather boots, worn down to the thread, and a broom strapped across her back like a rifle. She walked with the steadiness of someone who had traveled far and did not expect comfort when she arrived. She didn't wave, didn't speak. She simply reached the porch steps, paused, and held out a scrap of fabric, with handwriting inked in careful looping script, "Work for coin." Quiet, no questions. Jonas took the note, read it twice, then looked up into her face. She was young, 27 maybe, but her eyes were older, wary, sharp-ringed with a kind of exhaustion that didn't come from a single night's poor sleep. Her mouth was set not hard, just used to stillness. She didn't avert her gaze, but she didn't challenge him either. Jonas cleared his throat. "You clean." A small nod. He gestured toward the porch. "Stove's due for a scrape. Floor needs sweeping." She stepped past him without a word, pulled the broom from her back, and got to work. Jonas watched her from the doorway, arms crossed. There was no hesitation in her movements, no laziness. She cleaned like someone who needed to like every sweep of the bristles, might buy her children one more day of food, though he hadn't seen any children. She was alone. That struck him hardest. No man nearby, no wagon, not even a mutt trailing behind her coat. Just her, small, thin, silent. She moved through the space like a shadow present, but never drawing attention. She scrubbed the hearth, mended a frayed edge of the rug with string from her coat, even fixed the loose latch on the storm door with a nail she found in his tool bin. Not once did she speak, not once did she pause for rest. Jonas set a silver coin on the windowsill. She saw it. He knew she did. When she was finished, she wiped her hands on the hem of her apron, picked up her broom, and stepped back out into the cold, without so much as a glance in his direction. He waited. She didn't take the coin. It sat there untouched, catching the last light of the morning. By the time he stepped outside again, she had vanished into the trees. No tracks, no farewell. Like snow melting into snow. He didn't know why it stayed with him. It wasn't uncommon out in the wild parts of Colorado for wanderers to come and go. Dry Creek itself was full of the men and women with names they didn't speak and pasts they didn't carry on their sleeves. But something about her felt different. She didn't just leave quietly. She belonged to the quiet. That night, Jonas sat by the fire longer than usual, the button of his coat still cold from her passing. He thought of her hands, red raw, cracked at the knuckles, and the way she had cleaned without waiting to be thanked. He thought of how she'd looked at the cabin, not longingly, not fearfully, just briefly, as if memorizing the shape of warmth. When he rose the next morning, the coin was gone. He told himself it didn't matter. But when he found a small knot of thread tied around the porch railing, he knew better. She had taken the coin and left behind a piece of herself in return. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a world wrapped in silence and white. The snow had softened every edge of the valley fence post tree limbs, the uneven roof of the barn, all laid beneath a quiet so complete it rang in Jonas's ears. He stood at the window, one hand wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, the other resting on the cool wood of the sill. The glass was frosted at the edges, but he could just make out the footprints that trailed across his yard, small, light, headed toward the trees. She'd come again. Jonas hadn't heard her, not the knock, not the door. She'd slipped through his world like a shadow at dusk, leaving behind a broom leaned against the wall and a clean porch that still smelled faintly of lye soap and pine. And beside the hearth, a tin cup sat where he hadn't left it, inside a strip of cloth, damp, stained, blood. He stared at it for a long time. His first instinct wasn't alarm, it was sorrow. A slow ache that settled behind his ribs like winter settling into soil. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she came from, but something about the sight of that blood made his hands go still. He set the cup down gently like it might shatter from the weight of knowing. By noon he'd made up his mind. The climb wasn't easy. The snow reached his calves by the time he reached the ridgeline, and the path she took wasn't one made for horses or wagons. It was narrow and unforgiving, winding through thickets and under low branches that clawed at his coat. But she'd walked it, alone, likely carrying something or someone with her. When he crested the final hill, the sky had begun to darken. He saw the chimney smoke first, then the roofline, a broken spine patched with tarps and ropes sagging under the weight of snow and time. The structure had once been a miner's shed, now barely held together by willpower and hope. Jonas stopped beneath a scraggly pine and watched. The children were outside. Not playing, there was no room for that here. They moved with the precision of necessity, gathering firewood, melting snow in a dented kettle, mending something with twine. There were 5. The oldest, a boy of maybe 10, kept glancing toward the trees like he expected them to move. The youngest was no more than 2. She toddled across the dirt with bare feet, dragging a strip of cloth behind her, and then Ruth emerged. She moved fast, faster than he'd seen her move before, scooped the child up in one smooth motion, clutching her tight against her chest. She whispered something, pressing her lips to the girl's forehead. The child went still. Jonas felt something turn over in his chest. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. He had seen this kind of fear before, not in screams, but in silence. Not in running, but in staying very, very still. He didn't step closer, didn't call out, just stood there, hidden in shadow, watching the life she had not chosen, but somehow held together anyway. That night, he couldn't sleep. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but the cabin felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He lay awake listening to the groan of timbers and the faint howl of wind through the eaves. He thought about her hands, cracked, bleeding, still working. He thought about her children, how quiet they'd been, how practiced. He thought about how she had never once asked for help. At dawn, Jonas rose before the fire had gone cold. He packed a small sack, flour beans, dried fruit, a piece of cured venison from the smokehouse, and a blanket, a thick one. He wrapped it all in burlap and left the house without breakfast. He didn't leave the bundle at her door because she didn't have a door. He nailed it gently to the stump of an old pine just beyond the clearing, then turned and walked away. No note, no signature. Just kindness, offered freely, without expectation. When she came again, 3 days later, she didn't speak. She scrubbed the hearth, folded his shirts from the line, stitched a tear in his wool coat where the thread had frayed. Her hair was damp, her movements slower. She moved like someone who hadn't slept well in weeks. Jonas said nothing. But when she finished and turned to go, he was already standing by the door, a clean tin mug in hand. "For the road," he said softly. "It's not much, but it's warm." She hesitated, then took it. Their fingers brushed just for a second, but in that second, something passed between them. Not words, not promises, something quieter, truer. He watched her walk away, her boots crunching in the snow, and wondered what it was like to carry the weight of 5 lives and still move with such grace. Later that evening, as he stood by the fire sipping what remained of the coffee, he saw something by the window. A button, hand-carved, smooth, left where she knew he'd find it. A thank you, a peace offering. Or maybe just proof that in a world that had taken so much from both of them, something small could still be given back. Jonas turned the button over in his fingers until the fire died low. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel quite so alone. The days grew shorter, as they always did in December. By late afternoon, the trees stretched long fingers of shadow across the snow-packed yard, and the cold crept in through places Jonas had long since stopped trying to patch. The old stone cabin held heat poorly and memory too well. He'd lived in it nearly 15 years, most of those alone, and every room still whispered with the voice of someone who wasn't coming back. But lately that silence was changing. It wasn't loud, not yet. It was softer than that, more like the sound of small footsteps in the hallway when no one should be walking, the scrape of a pot on the stove when he hadn't moved, a muffled cough behind the door that never opened, and always her. Ruth came again that Friday, not with her children, not openly. She never brought them down from the ridge. But Jonas knew she'd come from them. Her coat was dusted with snow, her cheeks pink from the wind, and her fingers swollen around the knuckles. She carried no broom this time, just a tin pail with frozen laundry she hoped to thaw by his fire. She didn't ask. He didn't offer. It simply happened, her stepping inside shoulders hunched from cold, laying the damp clothes near the hearth, like she'd always done so. Jonas poured her a mug of coffee. She accepted it without a word, wrapped both hands around the tin like it might warm more than her fingers. The fire popped casting light against her face. He watched it reflect in her eyes, deep hazel flecked with amber when the light caught them just right. She still hadn't spoken since that whisper at the shed, but she didn't need to. Jonas had lived long enough to know that some silences carried entire histories. He returned to his chair not far from hers and let the heat press against the edges of his bones. Outside wind rattled the shutters like a song with no rhythm, the kind that played inside old men's ribs when they dreamed of war and younger days. "You get any sleep up there?" he asked, finally breaking the quiet. Ruth sipped, shrugged, then pointed to the hearth and held up 2 fingers. 2 hours, he guessed. She nodded. He leaned back, rubbing the edge of his jaw. "It's no way to live." She didn't answer, didn't argue either. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small sewing kit. One of the children's mittens had torn. She began mending it by firelight, her fingers deft despite the cold. Jonas watched the thread dance between her knuckles, the needle flashing like a sliver of moonlight. "You ever learn that from someone?" he asked, "or just figure it out along the way?" She paused, then pulled something from the inside of her coat pocket, a photograph. Faded, creased edges curling like autumn leaves. She handed it to him. 4 people, 2 women, 2 men, all dressed plain but clean. A little girl in one lap, a baby in the other. "Family?" he asked softly. She nodded. He didn't ask what had happened to them. The way her eyes lingered on the photograph told him more than words could. Loss had a way of living just behind the eyes. He'd seen it in soldiers and widows, in himself. They sat like that for a long while. No music, no talk. Just the fire breathing low and steady like a living thing between them. Jonas stood after a time, walked to the pantry, and returned with a small bundle of jerky and a glass jar of wild honey. He set them beside her laundry. For the children, Ruth looked at the items, then at him. He expected her to nod or to set them aside politely. Instead, she reached over and gently placed the mitten freshly mended on the armrest of his chair. A trade. He let out a slow breath, one that had been trapped in his chest longer than he realized. "I used to think this place would never be more than a tomb," he murmured. "Built by a man I barely knew, made home by a woman I buried too soon." And then he trailed off. Didn't finish. Ruth didn't press. She only leaned forward, picked up another mitten, and began to stitch. Later, when the fire had burned low and the laundry was nearly dry, she stood. He walked her to the door. The sky had turned navy stars like pinpricks in the dark fabric overhead. She hesitated before stepping outside. Then, without warning, she reached into her coat and placed something in his palm, a button, smooth hand-carved, probably off the baby's shirt. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask what it meant, but she was already walking away, the snow swallowing her footsteps before the door had fully closed. He held the button in his hand for a long time, and in that quiet, dim-lit cabin, Jonas Calloway realized the fire wasn't the only thing keeping the cold away anymore. Something else had started to live there too, something softer, something that looked a lot like hope. Winter had settled fully over Dry Creek by the time Ruth's presence became part of the daily rhythm in Jonas Calloway's cabin. The walls seemed less hollow, the hearth's fire freckled new warmth. Yet each ember carried the echo of silence. She never broke a hollow promise of safety and something yet unspoken. Jonas found himself watching her more than he meant to. How she coaxed steam from frozen clothes draped near the stove. How her lips curved slightly as she caught Scout's tail brushing her leg. How she kept her back to the door, always ready for something he couldn't name. He respected her quiet. It felt like a pact between them. But he also knew that silence could be a refuge or a prison. One morning, just as the pale sun broke over the ridge, Jonas found Ruth kneeling near the woodpile, her breath puffing in faded clouds. She was mending a torn sleeve of his coat thread, delicate as frost. He watched her in silence, hand on the door frame, heart pounding with that old ache, wanting to speak, fearing he'd break something fragile. "Coffee," he finally offered, voice low but steady. Ruth nodded, not looking up. She slipped his coat off the log and moved toward the door. Inside, Jonas warmed 2 mugs and set them by the fire. Later, she returned muddy boots, printing a path toward the hearth. He extended a mug, and she accepted it, holding it in both hands like an offering. He sat in the chair opposite her, their silent shapes framed by the glow of morning light in the frozen window. Neither spoke for a long time. The wind rattled the shutters. The fire hissed, and shadows danced between them. Jonas's gaze dropped to the mug he held. The metal rim was chipped. He rubbed his thumb over the dent. "Used to belong to my dad," he muttered. "He gave it to me when I left for the cavalry." Ruth's fingers tightened on her mug. She looked down then around at the cabin, so small compared to the valley outside. He paused. Her voice came then, not a word, but a soft exhalation that said more than speech. Jonas swallowed and tried again. "I was gone a long time," he said, surprised by the confession, fought across the rails. "When I came back, she was gone. Cancer. Left me with this place," and a silence that felt like a promise. He paused, expecting no response, but Ruth's eyes, those steady hazel pools, met his, and he saw something: recognition, compassion, a shared burden of loss. She pressed her lips together, then reached across the table and slid something toward him, a small, flat carving of a bird in progress. Rough edges, incomplete wings. Jonas turned it in his hands. "You carve." Ruth nodded. As her fingers traced the bird's curve, she tapped the wood twice, once on the beak, once on the tail. Jonas recognized the rhythm in complete wings' unspoken words. He set the bird gently on the table. "It's beautiful." Her eyes glistened as she tucked the carving into her apron pocket. Then she stood and began collecting her laundry. The next night, a fire sparked too loud in the hearth. As Jonas sat alone, the cabin emptied by the day's chores. He stared into the glow and thought about her, the firmness in her shoulders, the way she tucked her braids inside her coat, the weight she carried without complaint. A woman burdened by a past he couldn't name, yet determined to build something new. He stood and refilled the kettle, then carried both mugs and a thin blanket to the little bench by the window. The valley lay in darkness, a canvas of silver and black. He sat one mug in each hand. The other chair groaned as Ruth joined him. She didn't ask for the blanket, but he put it across her lap anyway. Under the hush, he finally spoke. "I don't know where you've come from or what burned you to bones, but this place," he gestured at the valley, the home that was once his refuge. "I want it to be a shelter, not a cage." His voice was soft, almost breaking. Ruth pulled the blanket tighter around her knees. Then with quiet precision, she thumbed the edge of the wood carving peeking from her apron. She tapped it once again, that measured touch, and released it. Jonas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. A week later, he awoke before dawn to the jingle of Ranger's bell, the third mule dog. He called Scout. Scout paced at the porch, low growl rumbling from his chest. Jonas rose, grabbed his coat. Outside, the world lay white and unmarked, no footprints, but theirs. He stepped back and spotted something unusual, faint tracks by the woodpile. They were boot prints, too large for Ruth's slender feet, too wide for Scout's leather hobnails. Two sets parallel, moving away from the cabin. His breath caught. He moved inside and found Ruth at the stove, simmering stew. Her eyes were distant, locked on smoke rising through the chimney. She didn't look startled. He watched from the doorway as she ladled broth into two bowls, set them across from the carving on the table. Jonas swallowed. "Tracks," he said low. Ruth looked at him. The firelight flickered across her face, and he saw the tremor behind her eyes. A faint clench of her jaw. She nodded once. They ate in silence. Each spoonful was a promise not of fear, but of defiance. By dusk, the storm had begun, snow swirling like ash through the tall pines. Inside, the fire burned steady. Jonas sat near the hearth. Ruth fiddled with her carving. Scout lay, curled at their feet. Jonas cleared his throat. "We leave tracks, too," he said softly. Ruth looked up, meeting his gaze. The tremor was gone. Instead, there was resolve. They both knew what that meant. Then sound, outside. Something gentle, deliberate, like someone kneeling among the wood. Jonas rose, squeezed her hand. "Stay." She didn't argue. He crept to the door, shotgun in hand, breath puffing in the cold air. There was no one. Only the snow thickening, and the prints, they stopped. Like the visitor vanished. He returned to the hearth. Ruth held out her carving, a bird with new wings carved deep. He took it. Their fingers brushed not with heat, but with purpose. And in that moment, Jonas Calloway realized the quiet had changed. It was no longer just his silence. It was theirs. The knock came just after midday, quiet but deliberate. 3 taps spaced like punctuation. Jonas had been working the fence line, mending the southern post, where last week's windstorm had torn the latch clean off. Scout lifted his head first ears, twitching toward the sound. Then came the 4th knock lighter, this time almost reluctant. Jonas wiped the sweat from his brow, heart tightening not with fear exactly, but the kind of knowing that came from years of reading weather and silence. He opened the door to a stranger. The man stood tall in a dark coat, dust still clinging to his boots despite the dry trail. His mustache was trimmed too neat for these parts, and his eyes were the kind that had memorized people for all the wrong reasons. Over one shoulder hung a leather satchel, edges creased from years of careful use. "Afternoon," the man said, voice smooth, practiced, looking for a Jonas Calloway. Jonas nodded but said nothing. The stranger smiled in that way men do when they mistake patience for weakness. "Name's Ambrose. I'm with the Colorado Registrar's office, Civil Services Division." Jonas's jaw twitched. He stepped forward, not enough to threaten, just enough to make his silence speak louder. Ambrose reached into his satchel, drawing out an envelope sealed in red wax. "I've been sent on behalf of one Edric Calder, husband to a Ruth Calder, missing for over a year now. He's filed a claim for property abandonment, unlawful removal of dependents, and a petition for legal recovery." Jonas didn't move, didn't blink, but deep inside him something shifted like earth before a quake. "She's not here," he said. Ambrose tilted his head. "Of course. But if you should see her perhaps passing through kindly, let her know the law is looking." He laid the envelope gently on the porch rail like he was delivering a folded flag, then tipped his hat, turned, and walked down the trail. Jonas watched until the man disappeared into the trees. Then he closed the door, picked up the envelope, and held it for a long time. Just held it, like it might explode. That night, Ruth came late. The wind had picked up, and she arrived with snow still clinging to the hem of her coat, her cheeks raw with cold. Jonas had been waiting not in the chair by the fire, but standing hands around the mug he hadn't drunk from in over an hour. She stepped into the warmth with her usual silence, but her eyes, they found the letter before they found him. Jonas didn't speak. He just held it out. She stared at it, unmoving, until the red seal caught the flicker of the fire. Her hand trembled slightly when she reached for it, but not from cold. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Instead, she placed it on the table, turned away, and moved toward the stove. She set water to boil as if it were any other night, but her shoulders were pulled too tight, her breath too measured. Jonas crossed the room slowly, as if walking into the kind of quiet that could shatter. "I didn't answer his questions," he said. "Didn't even say your name." Ruth nodded, once. Then she took a small carving knife from her coat, her hands steady now, and placed it gently on the mantel. Jonas knew what it meant. "I won't let him touch you," he said softly. Her back was still to him, but he saw the way her hands gripped the edge of the table. After a moment, she said barely above a whisper, "He doesn't want me, Jonas." She turned then, and her eyes met his, wide and bare like winter fields. "He wants to prove he still owns something." Jonas stepped closer, but not too close. "He doesn't. Not anymore." Tears did not fall. Ruth Calder had long since run dry of those, but she reached out then and pressed her fingers gently against the envelope, then pushed it into the fire. They both watched it burn, watched the red seal curl, watched black ink turn to ash. And Jonas thought, not for the first time, how the fiercest revolutions began in silence. After that night, things changed, though neither said so. Ruth stopped sitting with her back to the door. Jonas started leaving his rifle leaned just inside the threshold, loaded. Scout paced more at dusk. The children spoke in softer voices. Clara began sleeping, with her thumb tucked into the collar of Ruth's coat. And Jonas, he felt it everywhere. In the way Ruth brushed past him while folding the laundry, in the way her gaze lingered a second longer on his hands when he chopped wood, in the way she sat near him at night, close enough for warmth, far enough for dignity. They didn't speak of Edric again, but his shadow stretched into every moment like a blade. 3 nights later, Scout barked just before dawn, low and sharp. Jonas jolted upright. By the time he threw on his coat and lit the lantern, Ruth was already standing by the window, her face pale and tight. Outside, snow fell like quiet ash. Jonas stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. The woodshed was burning, not wildly, just enough to smolder to leave its black smoke curling through the trees like a signal. He put it out with 2 buckets and a wool blanket. And then he saw it. Nailed to the side of the shed, her old apron, torn, tied in a bow. Below it, carved into the wood with something sharp. "She is mine." Jonas stared at the words for a long time, not with fear, with certainty. He turned and Ruth was behind him, silent. She reached up slowly and tore the apron down with both hands. The knot came undone with a single pull. Back inside, Jonas didn't speak. He simply went to the storage chest by the hearth, pulled out the second rifle, and set it on the table. Ruth sat opposite him, her hands still stained with ash. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not the woman who had arrived that first day with nothing but a broom and silence. He saw someone who had survived the worst kind of war and still knew how to sew buttons on a child's coat. "You don't have to run any more," he said. Ruth looked up steady. "I won't," she said. Then she picked up the rifle, checked the chamber like she'd done it before, and set it beside her. And in that moment, Jonas knew. Whatever storm came next, they'd face it together. Not as saviors, not as victims, but as two souls no longer willing to be claimed. The days that followed did not pass. They coiled like rope, tightening around something precious. The wind shifted no longer, the lazy kind that carried pine scent and far-off birdsong. Now it whispered with purpose, rustling the eaves like a stranger's breath, too close to the window. Jonas felt it in the marrow of his bones, the way a man who once outran bounty hunters in border storms knows when something is coming. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. He moved through the cabin like someone preparing for siege, not panic-struck, but methodical, nailing the shutters tighter, reinforcing the pantry latch, checking the rifle's chamber twice before setting it down. Ruth noticed. She always noticed. She said little, but her silence now held weight, not distance. She moved with purpose, too, patching clothes that didn't yet need mending, lining the children's boots with dried moss, stacking jars of preserves by the root cellar. It was the kind of silence that belonged to people who had once hoped in vain and now lived by preparation. That evening, as golden dusk painted the hills, Jonas sat on the porch with Scout at his feet. He watched the trail disappear into the pines. Behind him, the warm light of the cabin spilled through the window, and from within came the soft clatter of dishes, the lilt of Clara humming to herself. Ruth stepped out with 2 mugs of chicory coffee, set one beside him, then lingered by the railing. Her fingers, slender and steady, curled around her own cup, as if drawing strength from the heat. "Do you think he'll come himself?" she asked quietly, not looking at Jonas, but at the stretch of twilight ahead. Jonas didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip, let the bitterness anchor him. "Yes," he said finally, "but not alone." Ruth nodded unsurprised. "Then we don't have long." They sat in silence, but it wasn't empty. It was the silence of decisions already made. She turned toward him, eyes darker than the sky. "If something happens, Jonas, if I—" He cut her off gently, but firm. Don't finish that thought. We're not scattering like leaves again." Her lips parted slightly as if she might argue, but instead she just breathed out and sat down beside him, their shoulders barely touching. That night, Jonas did not sleep. He sat in the chair by the hearth watching shadows dance across the floor. Scout lay at the door, unmoving, alert. Outside, the wind carried something different, not just cold, but intent, like it too was waiting. By morning, the cabin felt smaller. Jonas had lived alone for years in its quiet walls, but now with Ruth moving between the stove and the cupboard, with Nathan polishing the lantern glass, with Ben tugging on Tommy's sleeve, asking again for a story, the space felt full, not crowded, but vital and fragile. Jonas set about preparing not just for trouble, but for what would come after it. He taught Nathan how to lay a tripwire across the back trail, showed Lissa how to pack a haversack tight with only the essentials. He reinforced the hidden latch beneath the pantry floor. All the while, Ruth moved like a second rhythm in the same song, quiet but strong. That afternoon, she brought him a bundle of cloth. Inside her old apron, the one Edric had once torn and left like a message. "Make it useful," she said. He understood. Symbols could be reforged, pain repurposed. Together they cut it into strips to tie lanterns, to bind kindling. No longer a banner of ownership, now a tool of survival. As dusk bled into night, the children gathered near the hearth. Ruth read aloud, her voice, a warm thread winding through the shadows. Jonas listened not to the words, but to the shape of her voice, steady, patient, as if speaking the world into gentleness. He realized he loved her then, not in the flash-fire way of youth, not in the borrowed moments they'd stolen so far, but in the quiet, carved way of two people who had weathered the same storms and somehow still found themselves facing the same fire. But love in the West was never just about feelings. It was about what you'd bleed for, what you'd stand in front of. He would not let her be taken, not again. The warning came 2 nights later. A letter, folded neat, no envelope, left under a stone by the fence gate. Jonas found it at dawn. 4 words written in a hand he recognized from the firelit night. Tomorrow, dusk, be ready. He showed Ruth after breakfast. She read it once, then again, and simply said, "So it begins." Jonas nodded. "Yes, but it ends here." She didn't flinch, didn't cry, just laid a hand on his arm and whispered, "Then we make it count." They spent that day in quiet preparation, not frantic, not scared, resolved. When night fell, Ruth kissed each child gently on the forehead. She braided Clara's hair tight and tied it with a strip of soft red cloth. She laid her old knife in Nathan's belt and told him he had his father's hands, but not his fate. Jonas watched her and thought she looked like a woman who had stopped running, not because the threat was gone, but because she finally remembered how to stand. And he vowed, if she stood, so would he. No matter what came down that trail when the sun bled low. The wind shifted just after midday, sharp and clean, like a blade drawn across the ridge. Jonas felt it before he saw anything. He was on the roof, patching a loose shingle, eyes squinting toward the horizon, when Scout raised his head from the porch and gave one short bark. Jonas froze, hands still on the hammer. Below, Ruth stepped out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. She followed his gaze westward to the sliver of trail that wound down the slope from the high country. 3 riders, far off yet, dots against the rising dust, but even at a distance, Jonas knew by the set of their shoulders, the rhythm of their ride. Men who didn't come to talk. He climbed down, fast knees, aching boots, thudding against packed earth. Ruth was already walking toward him calm, but her breath was shallow, her fingers white around the apron's hem. "They're early," she said, "or we're late." Jonas muttered more to himself. He didn't ask her what to do. That decision had already been made. Nathan was at the chicken coop chopping wood. Jonas waved him over with a sharp whistle, then sent him running to the root cellar. Lissa gathered the little ones without a word. They'd practiced this games, they'd called it then, but today wasn't pretend. Jonas and Ruth moved like clockwork, checking latches, placing the kettle over the fire to boil, just in case, counting the matches, the bullets, the breaths. There wasn't panic, only focus, the kind born of too many close calls and not enough second chances. When the children were tucked away beneath the cabin, hidden beneath quilts in silence, Jonas and Ruth stood together at the window. The riders were closer now. The sun had dipped enough to stretch shadows long across the field, turning men into silhouettes, into stories children feared in the dark. 3, Jonas said, "Same as before." Ruth nodded, her jaw set. "Roland will be in the middle." She picked up the rifle, the one Jonas had restored from rust and time, and checked the chamber like she'd done it her whole life. She didn't tremble. Her hands were steady as stones. "You sure about this?" Jonas asked. She looked at him, and for a moment there was something fierce in her eyes. Not fear, not defiance. A fire he hadn't seen since the night he carried her through the snow. "I won't let him take them. I won't let him take me." Jonas nodded. "Then we stand." They stepped onto the porch together. The world narrowed to dust and hoofbeats. Each clop echoed through the valley like a drumbeat of war. The lead rider was young, eager hands, twitchy shoulders. The one on the left was older, broad, like a barn door. And between them, straight-backed and slow-smiling, came Roland Jansen. He looked like a man arriving for supper, hat tipped just so coat unbuttoned, mouth curled around a smirk that had bled towns dry. Well, now Roland called as they drew to a halt. "Ain't this cozy?" Jonas stepped forward, rifle slung but ready. "You're not welcome here." Roland raised his hands mockingly. "I come for what's mine." "She's not yours," Jonas said. "Neither are those children." Ruth didn't speak. She stood at Jonas's side, gun held low, her body still, her eyes steady. Roland looked at her and something dark flickered across his face. "You really think he can keep you safe?" Ruth spoke then. Her voice was soft, but every word hit like a hammer. "I don't need keeping, not anymore." Roland's smirk faltered. He leaned forward slightly like a viper coiled. "Then you've made your choice." She nodded once. "I have." The silence that followed was long enough to taste. Then without a word, Roland kicked his horse forward. He didn't get far. Jonas stepped directly into his path, lifting the rifle, but not aiming yet. "Turn around." The two men flanking Roland moved. One drew a pistol, the other slid off his horse. Everything happened in half seconds. Scout barked and lunged from the porch, catching the younger man by surprise. Ruth fired, hitting the dirt near the older man's boots, sending him scrambling back. Jonas didn't flinch. His rifle now pointed straight at Roland. "You won't leave this ridge standing if you take one more step." Roland's hand twitched, but he saw it. Then the fire in Ruth's eyes, the steadiness in Jonas's stance, the porch, the roof, the silence. This wasn't desperation. This was prepared. "You won't shoot me," Roland said, voice lower now, uncertain. Ruth took a step forward. "I already did," and she pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the air, hitting the saddle horn an inch from Roland's gut. His horse reared, nearly throwing him. The other two men ran gone like smoke, disappearing into the trees. Roland slid from his horse, staggering slightly. His confidence for the first time cracked. "You think this is over?" he spat. "No," Jonas said. "But you are." Roland stared at them. Two people who'd once been broken and alone, now standing together like stone against storm. He turned, got on his horse, rode off, without another word. The dust settled behind him like the closing of a chapter. Jonas and Ruth didn't speak for a long while. Then she exhaled, slow and trembling. "Do you think he'll come back?" Maybe Jonas said, "but he won't find the same people waiting." Inside the cabin, they found the children waiting by the trap door. Nathan with his small knife clutched tight. Lissa, holding Clara, who hadn't cried, just watched the door like she believed Ruth would always return, and she had. Jonas crouched, scooped Tommy into his arms. Ruth dropped to her knees and pulled the others close. They held each other as the last of the day slipped away, not in fear, not in victory, but in something deeper, something earned, the kind of peace that only comes after the fire. The morning after felt unnaturally quiet, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The sky was washed in soft blue, and a hush had settled over the ridge, like a blanket, too still, too careful. Scout sat by the porch, head lifted, ears twitching. Jonas stood just beyond the fence line, boot soles dusted with dew, eyes scanning the trail for a second wave that never came. But in truth, the war had already passed. Inside the cabin, Ruth moved like she was waking from a long dream. Her hands worked folding blankets, stirring oats, smoothing the children's hair, but her mind walked elsewhere, circling like a hawk above memory. Jonas could see it in the way she hesitated near the hearth, in the way her eyes lingered too long on the rifle set carefully in the corner. He didn't rush her. Never did. Instead, he came in slow, placed a mug of warm chicory beside her, and sat at the table without a word. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was full, like the air before a summer rain. Ruth sat, fingers curling around the mug. She didn't drink, just held it, letting the heat seep into her skin. "I was sure I'd break," she said, voice no louder than a breath. Jonas looked at her really, looked not as the woman who had once arrived, ragged and silent, but as the woman who had stood before a man with a gun and chosen not to flinch. "You didn't," he said. She shook her head slowly. "Not because I'm brave, because I was too tired to run." Jonas's hand drifted toward hers, not grasping, just near enough to be known. "Maybe that's what courage really is," he said, "the place we reach when we're done running." A long moment passed. Then Ruth leaned forward, elbows on the table, and finally took a sip. Her eyes shimmered not with tears, but something quieter. Grief, maybe. Relief. The weight of having survived. "He saw me," she whispered. "The way he looked at me, like I belonged in his saddlebag, like a coat he left behind in winter." Jonas's chest tightened. He wanted to break something, a chair, the horizon, anything to undo the years she'd lived beneath a man who turned love into a chain. But he didn't move. He listened. Because sometimes the fiercest act of love was stillness. Ruth looked up. Her gaze was steadier now. But when I looked at him, I didn't see a monster anymore. I saw a man, small, afraid, angry that I wasn't broken like he left me. Jonas nodded slowly. He wanted to own something that had already begun to heal. Outside, the wind stirred. A bird called from the pines, then soft and unsure. "Do you think it's really over?" Jonas took his time answering. He glanced toward the children playing with Lissa near the barn, Nathan balancing on the rail fence, Clara chasing a scrap of ribbon. "It won't ever be the same," he said. "But yes, for now, it's over." She exhaled deep and shaking, and when she reached for his hand this time, she didn't hesitate. That afternoon they buried the rifle beneath the old oak. Jonas wrapped it in oiled cloth, lowered it into a hollow, dug by his own hands. Ruth stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, the children watching from a respectful distance. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. It was not surrender. It was choosing peace. And peace, like seeds, must be buried deep if it's to grow. When they returned to the cabin, Ruth paused by the door. Her eyes swept across the room, the worn table, the stitched curtains, the little shoes by the hearth. "I never imagined staying anywhere this long," she said quietly. Jonas turned. "What changed?" She looked at him, then full and sure. "Me," he smiled. "Just a little, enough. That night after the children were asleep, after the lantern was dimmed and Scout had settled by the door, Ruth stood barefoot near the open window. Jonas watched her from the table where he'd been mending a hinge. She turned slowly, eyes catching the moonlight. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Jonas put down the hinge. He crossed the room, stood beside her. "Sometimes," he said, and he looked out the window, then back at her. "I think. If there's a life waiting for us, it starts here, in the quiet, with the hurt, and the healing, and whatever we make of it." Ruth nodded. Then after a long pause, she said, "Then let's make it something worth staying for." And Jonas, who had spent half a life preparing for flight, finally felt what it was to arrive. The morning sun drifted up slow, casting a pale, honeyed glow over Dry Creek. After a sleepless night, after Roland rode off, and hoofbeats faded into the pines, the valley sat quiet, not the silence of fear, but something closer to reverence. Jonas stood just past the chicken coop, one hand resting on a shovel he hadn't touched in minutes. His eyes were fixed westward on the place where the trail vanished. He told himself Roland was gone for good. He didn't quite believe it. Back at the porch, Ruth was dragging a plank of wood, working on the rail Clara had tripped over last week. She paused only when Jonas approached her face, still and unreadable, but her gaze softer now. "You should be resting," he offered gently, not as habit, but out of something deeper, something protective. Ruth shook her head and shaved a sliver off the edge of the board. "They say you have to rebuild before you can forget." She said it like someone setting a stone down and returned to work. Jonas watched her, remembering the woman who first arrived, silent, ragged, holding herself together with frayed thread and sheer will. Now she moved with quiet command, no longer surviving, beginning to live. That afternoon light slanted through the window and laid gold on the rough plank floor. Ruth stood beside it, holding a worn sheet of paper, the final affidavit she'd sent east, requesting her name be changed to Calder Cooper, a name with 6 letters and a history etched in bone. Jonas approached softly. He didn't touch her, just sat nearby, patient. Ruth's fingers traced the edge of the paper. "You ever think how a single signature can save a life?" Jonas met her eyes. "You reclaimed a name, but don't let the past decide how you carry it." She turned toward him, her eyes glassy but unbroken. "Do you know how many nights I cried over that?" His chest tightened. "You're worth more than 10 pages of paper." He hesitated. "You showed me what survival looks like and what grace does with the pieces." She didn't reply, just smiled softly, as if kissing him without moving her lips. That night, Scout stirred first. Jonas woke to find Ruth standing at the window, holding a new letter, Roland's last. "Stand firm." She whispered it aloud, 4 syllables heavy as lead. Jonas sat on the edge of the bed, eyes adjusting to the dim. He hadn't cried in years, had forgotten how, but he could have wept then, not from fear, but from how deeply he recognized her strength. "We won't run," he said. She placed the letter on the table. They didn't speak again that night, not because they had no words, but because none were needed. The storm might come again, but for now, they were standing, together. By sunrise, Jonas sat at the table, pen in hand. He wrote without flourish. "Sometimes a wall isn't built to keep people out, but to keep dreams from blown away." Ruth read the line, her eyes soft with something that shimmered between sadness and hope. She turned toward the open window and raised her hand into the first slant of sun. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "the children go to the market." For the first time since winter, Jonas stood beside her. "I'll ride with you." She nodded. "I think I'm ready." Down below, the children played Clara, weaving a pine crown, Ben tugging Nathan's sleeve. There were no guns, no fear in their movements, just the hesitant rhythm of life rediscovered. Later that day, with wind stirring the edges of memory, Ruth and Jonas hitched up the wagon. Camp. The old horse waited patiently as children climbed in with baskets and laughter. Something opened in Jonas's chest, then not fully, not loudly, but enough. Enough to know that whatever fear yesterday had planted, it no longer ruled them. They were choosing to live, not just breathe. He glanced at Ruth beside him, her hands gentle on the reins. "Do you believe we deserve this?" she asked, not looking at him. He watched her, watched the grace in her quiet, the strength in her stillness. Without a doubt. The wagon moved forward, creaking down the familiar trail toward a horizon that smelled like cinnamon bread and pine needles and something brand new. Behind them, the cabin stood sturdy, and even if Roland ever came back, he would not find the same people waiting. The morning sun drifted up slow, casting a pale honeyed glow over Dry Creek. After a sleepless night, after Roland rode off, and hoofbeats faded into the pines, the valley sat quiet, not the silence of fear, but something closer to reverence. Jonas stood just past the chicken coop, one hand resting on a shovel he hadn't touched in minutes. His eyes were fixed westward on the place where the trail vanished. He told himself Roland was gone for good. He didn't quite believe it. Back at the porch, Ruth was dragging a plank of wood, working on the rail Clara had tripped over last week. She paused, only when Jonas approached her face, still and unreadable, but her gaze softer now. "You should be resting," he offered gently, not as habit, but out of something deeper, something protective. Ruth shook her head and shaved a sliver off the edge of the board. "They say you have to rebuild before you can forget." She said it like someone setting a stone down and returned to work. Jonas watched her, remembering the woman who first arrived, silent, ragged, holding herself together with frayed thread and sheer will. Now she moved with quiet command, no longer surviving, beginning to live. That afternoon light slanted through the window and laid gold on the rough plank floor. Ruth stood beside it, holding a worn sheet of paper. The final affidavit she'd sent East requesting her name be changed to Calder Cooper, a name with 6 letters and a history etched in bone. Jonas approached softly. He didn't touch her, just sat nearby, patient. Ruth's fingers traced the edge of the paper. "You ever think how a single signature can save a life?" Jonas met her eyes. "You reclaimed a name, but don't let the past decide how you carry it." She turned toward him, her eyes glassy but unbroken. "Do you know how many nights I cried over that?" His chest tightened. "You're worth more than 10 pages of paper." He hesitated. "You showed me what survival looks like, and what grace does with the pieces." She didn't reply, just smiled softly, as if kissing him, without moving her lips. That night, Scout stirred first. Jonas woke to find Ruth standing at the window, holding a new letter. Roland's last, "Stand firm." She whispered it aloud. 4 syllables, heavy as lead. Jonas sat on the edge of the bed, eyes adjusting to the dim. He hadn't cried in years, had forgotten how, but he could have wept then, not from fear, but from how deeply he recognized her strength. "We won't run," he said. She placed the letter on the table. They didn't speak again that night, not because they had no words, but because none were needed. The storm might come again, but for now they were standing, together. By sunrise, Jonas sat at the table, pen in hand. He wrote without flourish. "Sometimes a wall isn't built to keep people out, but to keep dreams from blowing away." Ruth read the line, her eyes soft with something that shimmered between sadness and hope. She turned toward the open window and raised her hand into the first slant of sun. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "the children go to the market." For the first time since winter, Jonas stood beside her. "I'll ride with you," she nodded. "I think I'm ready." Down below, the children played Clara, weaving a pine crown, Ben tugging Nathan's sleeve. There were no guns, no fear in their movements, just the hesitant rhythm of life rediscovered. Later that day, with wind stirring the edges of memory, Ruth and Jonas hitched up the wagon. Camp the old horse waited patiently as children climbed in with baskets and laughter. Something opened in Jonas's chest then, not fully, not loudly, but enough. Enough to know that whatever fear yesterday had planted it no longer ruled them. They were choosing to live, not just breathe. He glanced at Ruth beside him, her hands gentle on the reins. "Do you believe we deserve this?" she asked, not looking at him. He watched her, watched the grace in her quiet, the strength in her stillness, without a doubt. The wagon moved forward, creaking down the familiar trail toward a horizon that smelled like cinnamon bread and pine needles and something brand new. Behind them, the cabin stood sturdy. And even if Roland ever came back, he would not find the same people waiting. A year had passed since they buried the rifle beneath the oak, 1 year of slow mornings and cautious hope. Spring had returned to Dry Creek, painting the valley in green whispers and early blooms. The children had grown taller, their laughter richer, their presence heavier in the cabin walls. Without realizing it, Jonas and Ruth turned that house into something more than shelter. It became a heart. Dawn spilled across the fields in gold bars, coaxing open every shutter and curtain. Jonas lay awake for a moment, listening to the soft stir of sheets and the gentle breathing of 2 children on either side of him. He touched Ruth's arm. She opened her eyes, sleepy but certain. "Good morning," he whispered. "Morning," she replied, voice thick with comfort. He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. She shifted, hugging close. In that moment, heart kept close to heart. They were home. Clara sang softly as she helped Ruth pour porridge into bowls. Ben attempted to whistle and ended in giggles. Lissa counted each spoonful for everyone. Nathan carefully buttered bread, humming a melody they'd all come to love. Jonas joined in, telling a poor joke about the mule's stubborn streak. Laughter filled every corner of the kitchen. bending the still open morning sky into joyful arcs. Ruth caught his gaze and smiled. He'd noticed that smile become her most frequent expression, quiet now, but never vacant. Mid-morning, Jonas and Ruth worked together in the garden. He turned the soil. She planted seeds in neat rows, beans, marigolds, squash. The partnership felt seamless, ancient, almost as if they'd done this together every season. He paused mid-spade. She looked up. "I was thinking," he said slowly. "This winter we'll build that second cabin for Lissa and Nathan someday. They'll need their own roots." She brushed dirt from her hands and came closer, heart warm as the sun. "That's a beautiful promise," she whispered, wrapping her arms around him. He rested his chin on her head. "I want all of you to have a place you can call your own." She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes, but they weren't sad. They were full of home. Late afternoon, a single horse appeared on the dusty road. Jonas noticed. First Scout barked. Ruth felt it too. They stood hand in hand on the porch, the children behind them. A woman rode forward, dusty and hesitant. She reined in a sorrel mare and stepped down, eyes flicking to the cabin. The children whispered. Jonas placed a hand on his son's shoulder. The woman walked to the edge of the porch. "Mr. Calloway," she began, voice thin but steady. "That's me." Jonas relaxed his posture, though his heart thumped. I'm Edric Jansen's sister. His sister." She paused, biting her lip. "He's dead." Silence. The statement landed like a stone. Jonas blinked. Ruth stayed frozen silent, but alert. The woman held herself steady. "He died last month. Natural causes. Some health issue." Jonas stared long enough for the words to sink in. Ruth's grip tightened on his hand. "I sought you out," the woman continued, "to tell you and to say, I'm sorry for everything. For what he put you through, for the fear he caused you, and mostly for the children." Ruth's breath trembled. Jonas looked at his wife. Her posture loosened the tension of so many months falling away. He motioned for the woman to come inside. They sat in the parlor. The children gave space but stayed close. The woman, Edric's sister, placed her bag down and cleared her throat. "I never could stop him. He was broken. I should have known, but I didn't protect him. And I'm sorry it spilled onto your lives." Ruth's gaze didn't waver. She swallowed hard. "Thank you for telling us this," she said, voice low. "I don't know more words to him." Jonas set his hand on her knee. She looked to him. He nodded. She continued, "I forgive him. And I forgive you all the Calloways for standing your ground, for protecting children." Tears shone in her eyes. The woman pulled a small box from her bag. Inside a tarnished bracelet, Roland's. She slid it into Ruth's palms. "It belonged to my mother. He wore it once. I thought maybe you'd want it. Let the past rest." Ruth closed her eyes and wrapped both hands around it. Later the woman left in the fading light. Few words were exchanged at the porch. When the front door closed, the cabin exhaled. Jonas found Ruth in the parlor. She sat in a rocking chair, the bracelet in her palm. Clara and Ben peeked at her. He knelt before her. "Edric's gone," he said softly. "We're free." Ruth lifted her head, tears wet in her eyes again. "He is!" He opened his arms. She stepped in. They held each other while firelight danced. That night, under the warmth of a broad quilt, Jonas and Ruth spoke low. Can we start fresh?" she asked. He kissed her forehead. "We already have," he replied. "You, me, them, they're proof." She smiled, leaning in to rest against him. In the hush, she slipped her fingers between his. They lay still, breathing the same quiet. When morning came, the valley sang again. Birds light small chores, all moving forward. Jonas and Ruth emerged side by side, the world renewed. She touched the bracelet on her wrist. He squeezed her hand. The new cabin plans lay on the table. Children giggled and tumbled in morning sun. Ruth looked up. Home. she whispered. Jonas nodded. Home at last! They inhaled the day together, no past chasing them, just a future they built brick by honest brick. The story of Jonas and Ruth is more than just a love ballad set against the backdrop of the old American West. It's a profound reminder for us today. Happiness doesn't come from perfection, but from the courage to love, to forgive, and to rebuild what's been broken. In our fast-paced modern lives, we're often swept up in routines, past wounds, and invisible fears that make us shut down emotionally. But like Ruth, who endured so much pain, she didn't let the past dictate her future. And like Jonas, a man who once kept the world at arm's length, he chose to open his heart, to protect not with power, but with steadfast presence and quiet, genuine love. The simple yet powerful message they leave us is this: don't be afraid to rebuild. Don't shy away from loving again. True love doesn't exist in the absence of storms. It's found in those who choose to stand together through them. And from that choice, a home is made steadier and more beautiful than ever before.